Dan DiSalvo's new book, Government Against Itself, Public Union Power and Its Consequences. A small proportion, less than 7%, of U.S. private sector employees belong to unions, but 35% of public employees do. As the book discusses, this historic shift to unions within governments poses large, difficult, and controversial political issues, since, as Dan writes, public sector unions are fundamentally political entities. These issues are tied to pressing economic and financial problems through the related strains on public finances. For as we all know, this is especially because of the propensity of public employees unions to generate through pension and benefit plans very large and often unaffordable buildups of future debt obligations, unfunded and in some cases unfundable. Dan is going to discuss his book for 25 minutes or so. Andrew Biggs will provide a discussion. We'll give Dan a chance to respond to Andrew and them to talk to each other. We'll then open the floor to your questions. Promptly at 7:15, unless your questions run out earlier, we will adjourn to a reception next door where here's the book. It will be for sale. We hope everybody will buy at least one, and Dan will be available to sign them during the reception, and you're all invited for a glass of wine. Our author, Dan DiSalvo, is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute's Center for State and Local Leadership and an assistant professor of political science at the City College of New York. His scholarship focuses on American political parties, elections, labor unions, state government, and public policy. In addition to this evening's book, he's the author of Engines of Change, Party Factions in American Politics, 1868 to 2010. He writes frequently for scholarly and popular publications, including National Affairs, The Weekly Standard, New York Daily News, The New York Post, The Tocqueville Review, Congress and the Presidency, and the Journal of Political History. And of course, we need to get you on the AEI blog. In a personal note to his new book, Dan draws this generational contrast. My grandfather, he writes, an immigrant from Sicily, was a member of the Steelworkers Union in Pittsburgh. My father was a member of the Carpenters Local. As a professor at the City University of New York, I am required to pay representation fees to a union as a condition of employment. One could see this story as the classic version of the Italian immigrant family, from industry to skilled trades to a white-collar professional. The differences between my experience and those of my father and grandfather are striking. I spend my time teaching classes, conducting research, and performing administrative service to the college, hardly backbreaking work. At the union hall I went to with my father as a boy, the focus was on bread and butter, wages and benefits. My union, led by people with PhDs, pays close attention to the state budget. The members are materially comfortable, and union meetings are known to veer into debates about such things as American foreign policy. Well, are public employee unions different from private sector unions? They are. Does this raise difficult public issues? It does. And we're delighted to have Dan here to present his insightful exploration of them. Dan, welcome to the AEI podium, which now has your name on it.
Well, thank you, Alex, for that generous introduction. It's wonderful to be here with all of you tonight. And I want to also thank in advance Andrew Biggs for agreeing to join me on this panel and talk about my book. I've learned an enormous amount from Andrew and his writings, which are frequently cited in its pages. It's also good to be here in Washington. I feel much safer, coming down from New York City, where this cold snap has brought in a severe case of blue flu, which I guess hasn't affected police here in Washington, but in New York, arrests have declined 56% in the last 2 weeks, and summonses and in addition, I believe traffic tickets have also declined by 90% over the last 2-week period in comparison to last year. So this has kept, at least in my hometown of New York City, the topic of public sector unions alive and well and on the front pages of the local tabloids. And I think this isn't just a one-off, and this isn't just something that has to do with the particularities of New York City politics, but really you could say that public employee unionism has been the central issue in American state and local government since the Great Recession. That's really when it kind of came to public consciousness, and I think it's likely to probably in many respects remain there as a central aspect or problem going forward. Journalists are paying more attention to it. People that cover state houses and city halls throughout the country are writing more about it. The public is more interested. And always a little lagging behind them are scholars, and I think they're taking a greater interest in this subject. So, and it's remarkable in some ways that scholars, political scientists, economists, haven't taken greater interest in public sector unionism, in part because it's remarkable insofar as the study of public sector unions is really the study of the political activity of the state's own employees. And that would seem to be central, of course, to my own discipline of political science, but this has gone in large measure neglected for years. There's a few good new books that are out, but nothing that really does what at least I try to do a first cut of in this book, which is sort of synthesize what we know, what's been done about all of public sector, the whole fascinating world of public sector unionism. And so what might explain this neglect? Why have political scientists and historians neglected this topic? If one takes historians, for example, there's enough books out there about Walter Reuther and the UAW to fill a few shelves, if not a room in a library. But there's not a single academic biography of Jerry Werf, who was one of the great leaders of AFSCME, nor is there a single scholarly history by a labor historian of AFSCME as a union, which is remarkable considering, again, the comparison to the UAW. The number of tomes devoted to it is quite substantial. So I think one of the things that really might explain this neglect is that public employee unions have been in a lot of ways lumped in with their private sector cousins. And analysts, scholars, activists, journalists haven't made a sharp and clear distinction between the two species of unions. And this is one of the things I do right in the beginning of the book, is try to show why public employee unions are fundamentally different from their private sector cousins. You could say they're of the same genus, but they're really a different species. And so I think there's a couple of key differences that I think it's important to stress. The first is that public sector unions get what I call 2 bites at the apple, meaning they can win benefits, pay, favorable work rules, better benefits for their members through collective bargaining, and that failing through political activity, lobbying and electioneering. And that's not true for private sector unions. If private sector unions, say you're the machinists union representing workers at Boeing in Seattle, you can win things directly for your members, but that really can only happen at the bargaining table. Of course, private sector unions are involved in politics, but that doesn't usually win things directly for their members in such an immediate fashion. So this 2 bites at the apple phenomenon is very important. It also distinguishes public sector unions from other interest groups who really their only avenue is the lobbying and electioneering angle. They don't get to collectively bargain. The second big difference is that public sector unions, unlike private sector unions, can really exercise influence on both sides of the bargaining table. Through their political activity, they can, in a sense, gain some leverage on those whom who are going to be acting as management in contract negotiations. I'll give you one example of this. When he was campaigning for governor against Chris Christie, John Corzine got a little excited, and before a large group of the Communications Workers of America Union in New Jersey, Corzine got a little amped up at the rally, and he said, you know, and they represent a lot of public employees in New Jersey, he said, we're going to fight for a fair contract. Now, that would seem a little strange since Corzine was running to become, in a sense, management, not labor, but he needed the CWA's money and manpower, more its manpower in the turnout operations, for his campaign. So in that sense, this ability to influence both sides of the bargaining table is really unique to public sector unions, whereas in the private sector, the stewardesses airline union at American Airlines has no influence over who the CEO of American Airlines is, virtually no influence. And then the third difference is the different character of public sector employment, which is different because public sector government is the monopoly provider of many services. So the lack of market forces really changes the entire collective bargaining dynamic in a multiplicity of ways. So those are, I think, three differences. I explore some others in the book. A fourth big difference is the origins and legal authority governing public sector unions. So whereas private sector unions emerged in the 19th century and had a long history, they really took off beginning with the Wagner Act in the 1930s. Public sector unions aren't governed by federal law. They're governed by an ensemble of state laws supplemented by local ordinances. So, and those really didn't start to take effect until the 1960s and 1970s. So I think now this is one of the reasons why I think there's been a lot of neglect of separating out and studying public sector unions in the academy, which is, if studying public sector unions would have to make people who are very invested in a now very common narrative of the labor movement in the United States, which is this rise beginning in the 30s up through the 50s and 60s, and then a decline since the 1970s in the private sector. But what I argue in the book is that almost every condition that analysts in the decline of private sector unions cite as a factor or cause could be seen as something that spurred the growth of public sector unionism. So it emerged at a different time, and it, in a sense, rose up, and it was growing as the private sector was declining. So studying public sector unions would force historians and political scientists to, in a sense, completely reconfigure their interpretation of the trajectory of the American labor movement and probably reassess its power in contemporary politics. So if that's the differences between public and private sector unions and a little bit on their historical origins and development, I then take up in the book some effort to assess their political power in the contemporary United States. And so I provide a wealth of data on donations to parties, candidates, parallel campaigns, and independent expenditures. I look at initiatives and referendum process in California and a few other states. I look at what they spend on lobbying and their lobbying activity at state houses and city halls throughout the country. And what I discover and analytically is that public sector unions, in a sense, are some of the biggest players in state and local government. That is, they're really outspending many of their rivals on donations to candidates and parties by large numbers. I'll just give you a couple of quick examples. The teachers union in New York State in the first decade of the 21st century outspent in direct donations to candidates and parties all business associations in New York State combined 5-1. The California Teachers Association in California outspent the next three biggest interests in California politics combined in the first decade of the 21st century, outspent the next three biggest interests combined. And that's, again, we're just talking teachers unions without putting into the basket firefighters unions, other public employee unions. So that gives you a sense that at that level, they're some of the biggest players. They also enjoy, beyond having lots of money, they also enjoy other advantages, which are direct access to politicians through the collective bargaining process, something that other interest groups usually have to fight for. They can more easily mobilize their members for protests because their members are government employees who are usually employed close to city halls and state capitals. I think the protests in Wisconsin were probably the most indicative of that. You don't want to take on public employee unions if your state capital is also right next to the flagship state university. And third, public employees have easier access to revenue than other interest groups. That is, their revenue stream tends to be very steady, very predictable, very stable, and very easy to collect because they enjoy what are called agency fees or agency shops and dues checkoff, where it's actually the employer or the government that's directly collecting their dues for them. So unlike the NRA or the Sierra Club, they don't have to go out and find people that care about guns or in the environment and get them to open their wallets and make periodic donations. And I would say fifth, they really enjoyed politically another advantage, at least until 2008, which was operating in a very low visibility policy environment. This came up every now and then. People would harp on public sector unions. One thinks of Bob Dole's 1996 Republican presidential nominee acceptance speech where he attacked the teachers' unions. But aside from a few flashes in the pan, for the most part, nobody really talked about public sector unions. People that covered state budgets and in state capitals didn't really do much about public employee unions. But I think that's one factor that has changed. So what does this power lead to? Well, I look at a bunch in the book of effects on public policy. The first is it increases the cost of government. The whole point of unionization is to win a better deal for people who are represented by unions, which is to say, to increase their wages, their benefits, and their job protections. But by doing those things, of course, that increases in a variety of ways the cost of government. And I'll just give you one quick example. Some data that I find in some studies that I cite in the book find that fire departments across the United States where collective bargaining is permitted spend on average 9% more on salary and about 25% more on benefits. So that you may or may not be getting better fire protection for that increased cost, but it's definitely costing your jurisdiction more if you allow collective bargaining and unionization. The second thing I argue in the book, and I try to provide a litany of examples to make the case, is that collective bargaining and unionization reduces government efficiency by increasing the large number of work rules and job protections that often emasculate public managers from really doing anything. I'll just give you two kind of quick examples to get at what I'm talking about. In, again, New York City, my home city, over the last decade, we've had I hate to dignify it by calling it a program, something called the Absent Teacher Reserve, the ATR, which is an artifact of a 2005 collective bargaining agreement between Mayor Bloomberg and the United Federation of Teachers, which held that as certain schools in certain parts of the city downsized, as there were fewer students, teachers weren't fired or laid off, but if they couldn't find other schools within the New York City school system to teach in, they would go into this absent teacher reserve, which in effect meant that they would continue to be paid their full salary and accrue benefits without teaching. And depending on who's doing the estimating, this costs between $100 million and $125 million a year for the city to pay a group of teachers, about 1,000 or 1,100 teachers, not to teach. This has been going on now for 10 years, so the city has in effect spent over the last decade a little over $1 billion paying teachers not to teach. Clearly not an efficient way to run your school system. Second example is, I'll take from California, which had to do with the power of the prison guard union in California in structuring its work rules, and in effect emasculating management. One work rule did not allow prison wardens to decide which guards would serve or work which duties, which would seem to be a basic management right. What are we paying the warden to do? There, under the system negotiated in a contract, and there was a sign-up sheet, and on the basis of seniority, guards could go and sign up for whatever duty they wanted to perform. So, say, even an older prison guard who might not be up to taking on some of the tougher cell blocks, but would like the extra money from hazard pay, could sign up for that duty, and the prison warden couldn't really say anything about it. So if you can't allocate your personnel in a rational way, that's really a restriction on government efficiency. The third problem I try to highlight is the effect of what I call crowding out, which is what Alex mentioned, the rising costs of pension and health care for retired public employees, a long-standing quid pro quo that occurs in public sector employment was for government to grant greater pensions, which would be paid at some future date, in lieu of handing out greater salary benefits. The problem is that since the Great Recession or before, these bills are slowly but surely starting to come due, and the rising costs, again, I'll give you an example from New York City. When Bloomberg took office, pension and health care and other retirement benefits for the city's public employees consumed in 2002 about 15% of the city budget. By the time he left office, it was about 34%. So this is creating, in many parts of the country, a huge divide in the Democratic Party over what to do about a government that costs much more but is able to do less. And I think it's obviously not the kind of government that conservatives would support either. So crowding out is partly an artifact of this pressure, and if you look at pension politics across the country, the big players or the big opposition to serious pension reform to reduce these long-term legacy costs, the central political actor is going to be public employee unions. Fourth, I look at ways in which the allowing unionization and collective bargaining in the public sector can often compromise other rights. Those of you who follow the Supreme Court have followed cases like Knox versus SEIU and more recently Harris versus Quinn, where Justice Alito has been developing an argument to show that collective bargaining in the public sector, to the extent that it's a more fundamentally political enterprise, because the union is taking a position on how much the government should spend on given services with which members may or may not agree, is a violation of members' free speech rights. So it's a violation of First Amendment rights to allow agency shops, which basically stipulate, as I'm an agency fee payer in my own employment now, you must pay the union even if you don't want to officially become a member. So I think the big effect, and I'll just close with this, is that public employee unionism has really transformed the labor movement and in part transformed the Democratic Party, and it's really transformed the character of state and local politics from entities that hardly existed to now becoming really the central players in American state and local government. Their effect in some ways has really been to win things for their members, but this isn't the kind of unionism we think about of my grandfather or father, which is kind of blue-collar working class unionism. We all tend to think of organized labor as representing, beefy white ethnics in hard hats and steel-toed boots, but that's really an anachronism today. And if we had to draw an image of sort of typical unionist today, it would probably be someone with a master's degree that teaches elementary or secondary school. So the effect in some ways of public sector unions has been to make the already affluent slightly better off at major cost, I think, to the public interest in a variety of ways. And I'll give you one statistic. From 1971 to 2004, as public sector unionism increased, the fraction of union members in the top third of the income distribution increased by 24%. At the same time, the proportion of unionists in the bottom third of the income distribution fell by half, which is to say that as public sector unionism grew, the old role of organized labor, especially in the private sector, of representing those with lower levels of education and income and boosting their income and job stability, that role has really disappeared in favor of a role of assisting the already affluent and those with substantial job protections. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, for an interesting summary of a very interesting book on the problem, which we both talked about, of pensions, especially when a business is declining in the case of a private pension, or when a population of say a municipality is declining. It reminds me of the old joke, which was, is General Motors a company with a pension plan, or a pension plan with a company? And you could apply this to various cities as well. Is this a city with a pension plan, or a pension plan with a city? And there are many other issues as you have explained. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our discussant, my colleague Andrew Biggs, who is a resident scholar at AEI. Andrew studies Social Security reform, state and local government pensions, and public sector pay and benefits. Previously, he was the Principal Deputy Commissioner of the Social Security Administration, where he oversaw its policy research, and Associate Director of the White House National Economic Council, where he worked on Social Security reform, and a member of the President's Commission to Strengthen Social Security. Did you succeed at that?
I blame others.
He is published widely in academic publications, as well as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, and has been co-chair of a blue ribbon panel to address the huge problems of the underfunding of public employee pension plans. And as we've been discussing, such underfunded and in some cases unfundable public pensions are a key forcing issue to this whole discussion, which makes your book so topical now in the current political situation. Andrew, looking forward to your comments.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. Thanks to all you for coming, and thank you very much, Dan. I really appreciate you coming today. Dan's book is just terrific, and it's really well worth the read. I wish I could write as well as he does. Dan's interests are broad, and his presentation is very interesting. My interests are more narrow and tedious, and so I'm not going to subject you to them. But there's one chapter of the book which deals with a debate we've had over the past couple of years of public sector pay issues. Of, are public employees overpaid or underpaid relative to private sector workers? I've been a pretty active participant in this debate, looking both at federal government employees here in Washington and also state and local employees. And I mean, my work has tended to show that public employees receive a premium relative to private sector workers. And it's an interesting kind of debate from the union perspective, because I would put out certain kinds of research, it kind of gets technical after a while. But this research would tend to show that on average there's a premium in the public sector. Then you would get other folks from public employee unions or groups sponsored by the union saying, no, we're not overpaid, we're actually underpaid. And it's a very odd sort of thing for the groups that are representing public employees in searching for higher pay and benefits, saying, no, in fact, we're not receiving higher pay and benefits. So I think they sell themselves short, though. But I think there's something in here I'll draw on a paper I put out last year with Jason Richwine, where we did a state-by-state comparison of pay and benefits for state government employees. And there's been studies before that have looked at state and local workers, and they tend to lump them all together and just say, let's just look at them as a group. And we found that breaking it out, looking state by state, really told you something interesting, because each state is different. And just to sort of give you the averages, what we found, we would compare state government employees to private sector workers with similar levels of education, experience, people living in the same areas, trying to control for as many different variables as you can, and then compare the salaries and benefits they received. On average, you find that state government employees receive a slight salary penalty. You know, the stereotype that the salaries are lower in government is in fact true, but they receive much more generous benefits, particularly on the retirement side. We're talking here traditional defined benefit pensions and retiree health care. When you add those two together, on average it comes out that state government employees receiving about a 15% compensation premium over similar private sector workers, meaning that they're receiving about 15% more in pay and benefits than those workers will be likely to receive in another job. What we found, though, is and this was kind of unexpected, was there's a ton of variation from state to state. We're using the same sort of methods, applying to different states, but we're finding that some states pay a lot better than others. And this was, when I was thinking about Dan coming here, this is where the union aspect of it came in. I'll just read a couple of the states that we found that pay very close to what we call market levels, where there really wasn't a premium for state government employees. Those include states like Virginia, Kansas, and Indiana. Those, Virginia and Indiana in particular, are known to have weak unions. Kansas, I don't know one way or the other, but these are states where you don't see enormous fights over public sector pay. There's not, there's not protests going on. They're not known for having this sort of conflict. Now take a group where we found a very large pay premium, which is a pay premium of 20% or more. That group included New Jersey, California, Rhode Island, Illinois, New York, Pennsylvania, and Connecticut. Almost all of them are, both by stereotype, states with strong public sector unions. They're also states which have had a lot of conflict over pay and benefits for public employees. It's a little, we didn't try to quantify it according to measures of union strength or anything, but my gut tells me that the strength of public sector unions are having an influence on this. And there's something meaningful here, in the sense that if you take, our lowest paid state was Virginia, where there seemed to be a slight pay penalty for state government employees over, relative to the private sector. Our most generous state was Connecticut, where we measured about a 40% total compensation premium for state government employees over private sector workers. You don't get, people will quibble, the folks at Economic Policy Institute or whatever, will quibble at how I run my numbers. They might say, well, you say it's a 15% average pay premium, we think it's around even, or whatever. But, and you'll have to trust me on kind of the methodology of this, there's almost no disputing that public employees in places like Connecticut or New York or California are being paid substantially more than similar public workers in places like Virginia or Kansas or Indiana. And it's substantially more, not just accounting for cost of living, because we're factoring that in, but they're just receiving a much more generous pay package. You don't hear very much that places like Virginia can't attract workers, that places like Indiana or Kansas. I met with the former governor of Indiana a year or so ago, and I had these results then, and I asked him, did you have trouble attracting employees? He's like, oh, not really. And so what that tells me is that I think there's essentially money being wasted here. That if the states that are paying close to market levels can attract and retain employees, which it appears they can, then the states that are paying much more than that, if you're Connecticut paying a 40% premium, that's money that could be going to other things. And I think that's one of the issues that Dan's book hits on, that elected officials, particularly Democratic elected officials, have kind of a split set of priorities. On the one hand, they believe in unions philosophically, but they have a practical interest in keeping the unions happy because the unions help elect them. On the other hand, most of these folks didn't go into government just to placate the unions. They went into government because they want to run anti-poverty programs or increase funding for education or all these sort of other priorities that they have. And so it creates a conflict for those folks in the sense of we only have so limited resources, and how do we allocate them? My second point, which plays off of that, is thinking about a way that some of these places are trying to deal with that issue. The big cost increase you've seen in recent years, and I think one of the reasons why this debate over public sector unions and public sector pay has come out is because of pensions. The average cost of pensions, I mean, Dan gave the example of New York City, which is pretty extreme, but the average cost of pensions or pension contributions for governments over the past 10 years has more than doubled. So so all across the country, pensions are taking up a larger chunk of the budget. There is less to go around everywhere else. But one way that states and localities are trying to address that issue is with how they finance their pensions. And particularly trying to get a higher rate of return on their pension investments by taking more investment risk. If you go back to the 1970s, the typical public sector pension was invested mostly in bonds and annuity contracts, this sort of very kind of old school kind of stuff. Over time today, about 3/4 of the typical pensions assets are in risky investments. Stocks, real estate, private equity, hedge funds. Despite all the kind of Occupy Wall Street stuff you get, the biggest investors in private equity and hedge funds in the country are public sector plans, which in some cases are virtual creatures of the unions. But this really produces something that I worry about, in the sense that the pensions are much bigger today than they were before, which means, if you go back to the 70s, the typical pension, their assets were equal to around half the government's budget. Today, they're equal to around 150% of the government's budget. So the plans are 3 times bigger today relative to the budgets of the governments that sponsor them. And they're taking substantially more investment risk. So this is it's a different animal. It's like the analogy I used once. I had this, before I got married, I had an Alaskan Malamute who was a very, very cute puppy, and then he grew into a 110-pound dog. And it was just the terms of engagement changed a little bit as the size increased. And you have something here with the pensions. They are much, much bigger than they used to be, and they are taking substantially more investment risk. My experience from talking to pension stakeholders, which includes people in unions, it includes pension trustees, includes the actuaries who work with these pensions, they don't have a very good understanding of the risks they're taking. And the analogy I used, my first job when I came to Washington, D.C. was for the Banking Committee on the House of Representatives, which dealt with all the housing issues. And well before the financial crisis and the housing crisis, you had people concerned, hey, Fannie and Freddie, they're taking too much risk. They're playing fast and loose. But then you had people who say, well, that's okay. They do so many good things for people. I do get concerned that in an effort to try to bridge this gap that you've talked about, in an effort to try to keep costs low for public employee compensation while freeing up money for other things, they're gambling. They're taking too much risk. And if we get a real hit in the markets, they're all investing in the same stuff, they all go down together. And that's where you get these issues of sort of systemic risk. So it goes beyond, I think, just sort of an issue of, is there a fleecing of the taxpayer going on? I think there's really potential that in trying to deal with these compensation issues, they're taking on risks that are very large and they don't understand very well. But I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrew. Dan, we want to give you a chance to respond to anything Andrew said that you'd like.
Well, what he said is rich and interesting. 2 reactions, sort of one to each of his points. The first part on pay, I rely a lot on Andrew's and others' work on the technical labor economist stuff for this stuff on comparative worth. But this, in part, his remarks made me think about one aspect related in 2 ways on pay. Is when it comes to the public sector, pay is often very distantly related, if at all, to performance. Unions negotiate salary schedules, and these salary schedules have a certain arc or trajectory. I know because I'm a public university professor, and my compensation is determined in large measure by a salary schedule. So whether or not I perform well, as long as I hang around, my compensation will move up on an annual basis as I get my step raises, regardless of whether I'm doing a good job in the classroom or serving on committees. And that part connects up not only to a question of efficiency and motivation, and I think there's no private sector enterprise that would organize its compensation in that way for what we expect government to do, the flexibility or power that management might have in public agencies. But it also connects up, if you think about say classic teachers salary schedule. It's actually very low on the front end, which is often used politically as how poorly paid teachers are. But it gets very sharp and steep towards the end. And that is where it comes into the pension question. Because when we talk about the generosity of pensions, it's not even all public employees are getting these. It's really the lifers. It's the people that stay in the system the longest, and actually many people are penalized for, say, working in public service for a short period because they don't work long enough to vest in the pension systems. So if we didn't have these collective bargaining agreements, we might see a flatter salary schedule that offered more portable pension systems that would incentivize, say, younger, ambitious, energetic people to work and serve in government for a short period rather than allocating so much of our resources, both in salary terms and then down the line in retirement, to the most senior employees. So it's really the people who are really making out very handsomely in the public sector are those who stay the longest. And that was Andrew's first point. My second reaction goes a little bit into the politics of the greater risky investment strategy. And I have a long section in the book where it discusses a lot of political science research on the effect of lobbying by unions versus business, and whether there's a bias. This is a long-standing debate in political science, whether there's a bias in favor of business getting its way in politics, and whether unions can be a counterweight to that. What I argue is that public sector unions aren't going to be that kind of counterweight that many liberals hoped against big business. And even rhetorical flourishes aside, one of the key reasons Andrew touched on in his remarks is because now they're so in bed with Wall Street doing well. That is, insofar as public employees are very dependent on high stock market returns, it's very hard to criticize Wall Street. That is, in that sense, public sector unions or the labor movement is now more dependent on its nemesis, banks and big business, than it's ever been before. So in some sense, de Blasio, again, maybe I'm being too local and parochial in New York, but the 17% returns that the city's pension funds received last year is manna from heaven. It reduces their ARC payment. It allows de Blasio's budget people to say, it's no problem to give the teachers 20% raises going forward. We can afford this as long as Wall Street continues to do well. So what I argue in the book, and I try to show in a number of ways, is the ways that actually public sector unions and business are often closely allied in different ways, and especially the most hated elements, you could say, of the business community, which is the 1% or people in the hedge fund world, whereas private sector unions often did ally with business, but it tended to be smaller business, smaller firms. What they wanted was a sound fiscal environment where business could grow, and that would create jobs in the private sector, where there's a very different dynamic in the alliances between public sector unions and the business community.
Andrew, other comments or thoughts?
Very good.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to open the floor to your questions. May I remind you that we ask you to wait for the microphone when you're called on. Here is the mic right here. Tell us who you are, what your affiliation is, and then ask your question. And if you feel compelled to preface your question with a dissertation, the chair will remind you at some fairly soon point to come to your question. So any questions for Dan or Andrew, or both? Yes.
Hi, I'm Victor Nava. My question is, the last couple of years, most of the public pension reforms that have been proposed have only applied to new workers, new hires, and it hasn't affected existing employees. So, but even with that being the case, there's still a lot of public sector union opposition to these reforms. What's the main reason behind that? Is it because they're worried it's going to affect their, recruitment of new public sector employees?
I'm happy to. Yeah. you make an interesting point that there have been a number of pension reforms around the country. There are a few states like Utah which have done really fundamental reforms. Most have been a little around the edges. It's in general, in the public sector, changes to pension benefits are restricted only to newly hired employees. There's a general precept that you cannot, in neither the public or private sector, can you default on pension benefits somebody has earned. But in the public sector, there's the supposition that neither can you change the rate at which they earn future benefits, the accrual of future pension benefits. There's no protection like that in the private sector. In the private sector, they can't default on old benefits, but they could freeze your pension and change the terms or whatever. The problem with this restriction is, I think it shifts all of the costs to newly hired employees. It's a place like New York State, it's different tiers of benefits. And I remember meeting with people from the New York pensions, and they basically said the lowest tier for newly hired employees is so ungenerous they consider it to be unsustainably so. They figure they're going to have to raise benefits, but it makes it very, very tough. I mean, with any sort of underfunding, be it these pensions or Social Security or whatever, you want to spread the costs over as many people as possible so that everybody bears a little bit of the pain, everybody has some time to adjust. But if you will not affect current employees at all, you're lumping. I mean, these plans are, using honest accounting, are underfunded by somewhere around $4 trillion. Shifting all of that onto newly hired employees would be very, very tough.
Dan?
I guess I would also add, I mean, from the unions, kind of go at your question on the political dimension of why do the unions still oppose it, even if it's modest and it's only going to touch what they call the unborn, which is to say the people that aren't hired yet, they haven't been born into public service yet. The main reason for them is what they want to do is keep things much more uniform, right? That is, because unions are legally required to represent all employees in a bargaining unit equally, for them it becomes problematic if you have similar workers doing the same job, but one person has a much more generous pension package. That can create, in effect, dissension and division within the union ranks. It can make union elections much more complicated and difficult. So that's what, when you see collective bargaining agreements, and my example of the salary schedule, it's one more way, in a sense, that for union officials and union leaders, they want uniformity across all of their workers, because if you start behaving like the private sector and doing things like merit pay and so on, you're going to really then create factions or different groups inside the union. So from a political point of view, uniformity for them internally is much more palatable.
You all may remember the wonderful line of Dr. Samuel Johnson, which goes something like, "Depend upon it, sir, the sight of the gallows tends to concentrate the mind." In financial terms, the sight of the gallows is opening the cash drawer and finding out it's empty. That is the ultimate economic forcing event. I mean, it's one thing to tote up your obligations versus your assets and find out the obligations are a lot bigger, which is the case with these pension funds. But that's not the same as running out of money. And when you ultimately run out of money, that forces you to do something. Now, we just had a very interesting, really counter case to what we were just discussing in the recent omnibus appropriations bill, which is allowing union-sponsored or so-called multiple employer plans to cut benefits, cut vested benefits, not only for active employees, but also for retired employees enjoying pensions. Now, that's a really remarkable and important political event, I think. And this was done with the political cooperation, both of the employers who are involved and the unions. And the reason was they had the sight of the gallows. They had the sight of these plans not only being insolvent in the sense of negative net worth, but having no money. And then they look to the government guarantor or insurer of these pensions, the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, and it is going to run out of money for the multiple employer program. So you get this forcing, and it's also almost it's very interesting. so it almost creates an insolvency proceeding, somewhat similar to bankruptcy, except the same guys who created the insolvency get to decide who gets cut, which is pretty remarkable. But this is a really interesting case, I think, of maybe things to come as the reality of running out of cash hits home. You agree with that, Dan?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'd be curious to hear Andrew's views on, I think, Detroit and so much of the legal activity of litigation that's occurred, which is to say government had a free hand to do what it wanted for the unborn, but you couldn't touch people already retired on fixed income. And the real question, I think, in the post-Detroit bankruptcy world, or post-Rhode Island, take your pick, is, and obviously the litigation there is ongoing, is what could be done in the public sector for people in midstream, either pre-vested, post-vested, where they are, what legally, how much flexibility or margin of maneuver government will have. I'd be very curious to hear your views on that.
Well, I think this hits on, I mean, the example that Alex was talking about was what's going on with corporate pensions, so it's private sector versus what you're seeing in Detroit and elsewhere in the public sector. And it strikes me as a different kind of outcome. And I think probably because in the public sector you have this option of in some way turning to the taxpayer or issuing debt. And I think this hits on the sort of the dual track way that unions can approach things, in the sense that they have collective bargaining rights, but they also have political power. And if you look at Detroit, or if you look at Stockton or San Bernardino in California, all places which are bankrupt, the pension benefits didn't take that much of a hit. And in some of these places, they're getting sued because the bondholders say, look, we came away with nothing, and the pensions are still being paid. How does this work out? And I think that's sort of an example of I know it's strictly political power, but it's also a much more sympathetic, the retired firefighter or teacher losing her pension versus the guy on Wall Street. But politics enter into these issues in the public sector, whereas in the private sector with the multi-employer plans, I mean, there just isn't the money to pay it, and so to a certain degree, at least, it's just not going to get paid. But it's an interesting kind of dynamic, and I guess I'll pose this question to you, Dan, in a slightly different way, of thinking about how this dynamic of union power works. I remember during the Wisconsin reforms, when you had Scott Walker there as a governor, tried to do reforms to union bargaining, to pensions, et cetera, and you had big protests. And I remember President Obama calling this is an assault on the union rights and all that. And it turns out that federal employees, although they're unionized, don't have as many bargaining rights as the state employees did, even post-reforms in Wisconsin or most other places. At the same time, federal employees are generally considered to be pretty well paid, even compared to state and local government workers. They do have, the unions are meaningful and powerful. So I guess my question is, how much do you think power for unions in the public sector derives from the formal rights of collective bargaining, and how much is the softer influence of electioneering, proximity to lawmakers, and things like that?
Political contributions.
Political contributions.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to put a numerical estimate on this.
I want a percentage.
A percentage. A good economist always wants a percentage. I would say much of this stuff, it's very hard to parse, and certainly the econometric studies, the few that have tried to do that and come up with that, it's very hard. But I guess my own, in doing the research and talking to people and doing interviews for the book, I think people focus on the collective bargaining part and the dues check off and so on, as that's where the power comes from. And there's certainly a lot to that. You need to have a lot of money in the kitty to make yourself a player. But often in a lot of places, and outside of bigger cities, it's really the manpower issue and the proximity to lawmakers. I mean, in some cases, you look at some school board elections for teachers union power. You look at sheriff's elections in smaller towns and cities, it doesn't take a lot of money to win these elections. What it really takes is door knockers and people getting out there and telling their friends, and it's those in-kind contributions, which are much harder to quantify, that can often really be very important. And you think about small, off the radar, people aren't paying attention, state legislative seats. Unions can exercise an enormous amount of influence and power in those cases without spending tons and tons of money. And, obviously journalists and other people focus on, where what seems like the big action is, but that baseline element of exercising so much power in state legislatures can come without spending a lot of money, and it comes from the fact that teachers, firefighters, police officers, corrections officers are quite evenly spread across the whole country in a way that say private sector unions are concentrated in really specific geographic areas. I guess this leads me to one other reflection on the pension politics, which is I think that the dynamics of pension politics have really changed post-recession. If you looked at the politics of pensions as they grew to these giant enormities from the 70s to say 2008, it was a pretty clear political dynamic. The unions public sector unions were growing. They were deeply entwined and embedded with the Democratic Party, which tended to favor this for a variety of reasons, but they would propose increasingly sweet formulas for the defined benefit pensions. Republicans in state legislatures didn't really have any incentive to block. They didn't see this as a place where they could make political hay. Sometimes they themselves were involved with the unions. So it was a really one-sided affair. Post 2008, I think the politics are different. Democrats are deeply divided about what to do about this. Republicans are now under pressure from Tea Party and other groups to really start to behave like conservatives on this issue and push back. And then, of course, there's still a large element of state legislators that are still deeply entwined with the unions. You see this most clearly, this dynamic, I think, in Illinois, where you see the state legislature, in some sense, the governor, both Quinn was the biggest proponent of pension reform, but you had a huge slice of the Democratic Party in the state legislature that said, well, we're not going anywhere with this.
If I could just, can I just hit, okay, sorry. Oh, yeah, I don't want to deprive.
If you would like to take it. We have another question from the audience. Back here, please. Yes, and then we'll come to you. Over here.
I've got the mic. I'm sorry.
Well, you didn't get
I'm Chuck Lane. In
Go
some
ahead.
ways,
and then
Andrew.
we'll pick up these next two. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. In some ways, Andrew anticipated.
You have to identify yourself, please.
I
And your
did, but you
affiliation.
didn't hear it. I'm Chuck Lane. Andrew's question kind of anticipated this one, but I wanted to go at it just this way. Is the problem public sector unionism per se, or is the problem collective bargaining? Because the state Andrew mentioned, where the cost of labor and compensation in the public sector is kind of fine, Virginia, also happens to be, I think, the only state in the union where collective bargaining is forbidden across the public sector. And it's a right-to-work state. It's sort of a double whammy. So there's no dues checkoff, and there's no collective bargaining. And as far as I can tell, there are public sector unions. The NEA exists in Virginia. It's quite active in the suburbs here. And they exert pressure through other means. And what that tells me is that you can have a union in the public sector, and yet you have an efficient state government, minus collective bargaining. So I'd like your reaction to that suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, I think your question allows me to make an important distinction that probably should have been made. It was, in a sense, collapsing unionism with the full ensemble of collective bargaining and union security provisions. In fact, I think Virginia, in some ways, provides a good model for where some states are moving, which is to say that what are called unions, the NEA in Virginia, are really just associations representing the willing and militant among public employees. And I think that goes with their First Amendment rights of free association. No one, least of all me, is proposing that should not be permitted. and their ability to lobby the state legislature and behave like other interest groups on the American political stage, I think that's fine. But you can see that what the double whammy is: you get union security and collective bargaining with exclusive representation. That's a much different animal as a public sector union than just an association of the willing and able that you have in Virginia. So really what I'm getting at of public sector unionism is I mean much more something that has the full panoply, and there is a bit of a sliding scale from, let's say, New York and California to Virginia, but I think the issue is you get those two things, they work in tandem, and that's what gets you the two bites at the apple phenomenon.
With a mandatory membership.
Mandatory membership, right?
Okay, I have a question here, please.
Hi, I'm Brian O'Keefe. I'm a labor attorney at Baker Hostetler here in Washington. And actually, my question is kind of a follow-up to that. And I don't know if your book addresses the concept of interest arbitration, which is very specific to the public sector. In the private sector, it doesn't really exist. And under the National Labor Relations Act, you can reach impasse, and the employer can basically implement its last best final offer, and that actually gets both sides to reach an agreement more readily because the unions don't want the employer just to reach impasse and implement. And in the public sector, there's usually interest arbitration, so if you don't reach a deal, a third-party arbitrator just comes in and says, well, your wages are going to be X, Y, Z. And I don't know if your book touches on that. I think that actually really messes up the whole collective bargaining process because it's not like what it is in the private sector, and actually gives unions another advantage in the public sector just to hold out and let an arbitrator decide what their wages might be, and they'll usually get a better deal than what they might even get at the bargaining table.
Yeah, I mean, I go into this debate not at great length, but citing the relevant literatures here and discussing the basic argument among economists is whether interest arbitration, which was in effect the solution that state governments came up with, that is by not allowing public employees the right to strike, which only 2 states allow, Illinois, that's why the teachers could strike against Rahm Emanuel, it is one of the states that allows right to strike, but the replacement was binding arbitration. There's been a kind of ongoing debate among economists whether binding arbitration led to more favorable deals for the union side, or whether or not. I think the balance of the evidence suggests that over time it does, as you suggest, tend to privilege the union position. The most extreme case of this is, again, New York State has a law called the Triborough Amendment, which, if any of you followed the recent negotiations between the de Blasio administration and the teachers, this was, everyone was saying, well, the teachers had worked so long without a contract, as if this were some great punishment. It wasn't. The teachers were still earning their step raises under the contract, because once the contract expires under the Triborough Amendment, if you don't negotiate a new one, the old one stays in effect, which obviously had a big incentive for the teachers' unions and all the other unions to say, well, we don't want to negotiate with Bloomberg in the middle of the downturn. We'll just keep our step raises moving and wait for a new election and a more favorable economic climate, which then allowed for back pay and things that Bloomberg had argued were off the table. So that's the most extreme version of the binding arbitration point.
Yeah, I'll just to touch, just anecdotally, I just happen to be on the budget committee of the small city where I live, and these sort of compensation issues are an enormous issue. And when I bring my work hat in and say, we got these sort of things, what can you do? And they say, well, the union won't agree to it, we'll go to arbitration and we'll lose. And so they kind of shrug their shoulders. And it's a very, that may be unique to this situation, but there's definitely perception, at least at times, that they're not going to get a fair shake. And I could get into specifics of how some of these things are done, but even when I looked at it, I said, okay, yeah, you're not going to get a fair shake, no bother.
Thank you. Very interesting aspect to the problem. I think I had a question over here. Yes, please.
Hello, my name's Joe Schulte. I work out in Bethesda, unfortunately in the private sector. after hearing those statistics. I actually was just in Chicago recently. My friend is finishing up his second year of Teach for America, and he painted a picture of 2 years in Teach for America students. Most kids then go to grad school or law school, but he wants to be a teacher. So that means you will work in Chicago public schools, then get fired before 3 years because that's when they have to start giving pension benefits, and basically gave an idea where he felt like Teach for America teachers are being used as scabs almost, kind of like running over to not have to pay the benefits off. I just wondered what your opinion was on that specifically.
Well, Teach for America has obviously come in for criticism from the union side as being exactly that, as putting very young and inexperienced people in the toughest classrooms. At the same time, Teach for America has also been the source of some of the most fierce union critics. That's where Michelle Rhee, for example, here in Washington, D.C., cut her teeth, was originally in Teach for America. I think the big issue is, again, this issue of the salary schedule in a lot of education policy does not provide, if you're coming in Teach for America, you get some additional bonus, but if you're coming in with just a bachelor's degree, the starting salaries for teacher are quite low. In New York City, under the current contract, I believe it's $43,000 a year, which is a hard salary to make a go of it in New York, even if you're just recently graduated college student used to eating ramen every night. So in that sense, the issue becomes whether teachers can move on. Now, the question is turnover so bad at the outset? A lot of the research on teachers that I'm familiar with suggests that teachers, in terms of experience, the most important experience is the first 5 to 7 years. I mean, I guess my own experience as a teacher, as a university professor, I think I'm pretty much baked at this point. I'm cooked. I'm as good a teacher as I'm going to be. I've been a university professor now for 10 years. I'm as good in the classroom. I've got my shtick down. It's probably not going to get a lot better, and hopefully it won't get much worse. And so my own experience, it confirms a little bit what I find in this research, is that it just doesn't change. Now, so paying teachers more on the longevity steps after that, you're not really tying that kind of pay to incremental increases in performance. Now, there may be some oddities there, but really people are going to decide whether they're cut out for teaching, whether they're really good at it in that first 5 to 7 year window. So I guess I'm not altogether convinced that churn in employment at that early stage is altogether a bad thing.
Maybe I'll just hit on a quick pension-related point, because you raised, and this goes to what Dan said earlier about how the way pension benefits accrue under these traditional defined benefit plans. I mean, if you have a defined contribution plan, a 401k, the accrued benefits kind of just rise like this. It's fairly steady. With a defined benefit plan, you can go quite some time, 15, 20 years of employment, and really accrue very little in the way of pension benefits. And then beginning your 40s up to your mid-50s, it shoots up. And then after that, it peaks and starts to go down. And that really does affect the incentives that people face. For a short-term employee, somebody going to teaching for a few years, they're accruing next to nothing in pension benefits. But the churn, the high turnover rates there are what help finance benefits for the full termers. It's with a 401k type plan, you have the risk of the market investments you make. With these traditional pensions, you have the risk that you're going to have to move or leave your job mid-career. I mean, think of a teacher who are often female, often a secondary earner. If the husband is transferred to a new job out of state and she has to move, she could be leaving several $100,000 on the table. It's a very strange set of incentives that are presented to people. And I think shifting either to 401ks or to cash balance plans, which are kind of a hybrid, I think that could do some more for teacher retention, particularly in those early years when the deal really isn't all that good.
I'd like to ask one more question, and then we'll adjourn. Seems to me one of the characteristics notable in financial terms in public employee contracts and pension systems are the very early retirement ages. They allow you to get, there's not only in public unions, but a lot of this 30 years and out and so on. So if you work 30 years by the age of 52 and you're going to live till 85, you're going to expect to sit around and be paid for doing nothing for longer than your entire working time. Is there any discussion, and I know you've got a whole list of things you can do to address various issues in here, but about addressing this what seems to me really unreasonable early retirement sort of issues, and they're particularly notable in public employee plans.
Well, your question touches on a really important cost driver when we're talking about the legacy costs for state and local governments, public employees that we haven't touched on, which is the healthcare side. And the fact that so many of these plans so many of the pension plans allow people to retire early, say at 55, sometimes even earlier. In that sense, that's extremely costly, but raising the retirement ages in the public sector would not only have the benefits of, let's say, reducing the long-term pension liabilities, but it would also have a major effect on reducing the health care liabilities, which are mostly on a pay-go basis and are not pre-funded and are very, very large, because the most expensive slice of state and local healthcare liabilities are the healthcare plans that cover people. Let's say if you are a firefighter and you retire at 55, that cover you until you get to Medicare, and then you get a full ensemble of healthcare benefits, and that plan is very expensive. Now, many healthcare benefits also provide supplemental to your Medicare post 65, and those can be expensive too, but they're far less expensive than covering the full thing in that period. So reforms such as raising retirement ages or making mandatory retirement ages at a certain point, would be, I think, wise. I mean, just one example, New York City is currently paying over 10,000 police officers on pensions, 10,000 former police officers under 50. And with life expectancy at 80, that's going to be a very long time to be paying those pensions.
Andrew, parting shot, 1 minute.
Well, I'm just the actual question you asked gets into very complicated kinds of issues, because I think the having folks work longer makes sense, but the structure of the pensions are such that what you call the negative accruals for somebody working from 55 to 65 is probably $250,000, so they're not going to want to do it. And so I think they really need to rethink how all this stuff gets set up. But I guess just to close, I just say these really important issues, Dan. I'm very, very happy you came down here. I mean, it's just a terrific book. You're a great writer, and this is stuff that I think is really relevant for people thinking about government, because it's become such a big part of what we do.
It's a good closing comment. Dan, thank you very much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
You're very kind. Thank you.
We hope to see you all at the reception next door buying books, and Dan will be available to sign them.